it would be quite rare for me to present work which has already been published. When this talk was set up, it was going to be back in February or March when I was hoping to be in Canberra for a visit. And at that point, it was still kind of under review and under construction. So it seemed, you know, that would have been a better time to do it. The reason I thought it might still be worth presenting to you guys is everything to do with the audience, really, because the paper that I'm going to talk about was intended really as a kind of discussion piece about deliberative democracy, and this reflected the papers that Nicole curated for that special issue of the journal. And I think that, by the way, that's a wonderful achievement. So let me just say here, congratulations to Nicole and everyone involved in that for putting together a really, really good inaugural issue of the Journal of Democratic Deliberation. But I think the people who wrote pieces for that inaugural issue, including myself, I guess we saw it as part of our charge to try and give a kind of state of the discipline, a set of reflections. And I forget what Nicole invited me to talk on. I think it was something like deliberation in an era of unrest. And I think she mentioned the Hong Kong anti-extradition movement and Black Lives Matter and maybe one or two other. And I thought that was a good topic. And when I went away to think about how to present it, I think there were two or three themes that I thought might be interesting to talk about and which I talk a little bit about in that paper. And I think because this is the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and because you guys are so far ahead in terms of your knowledge of what's going on in deliberative democracy, I kind of hope it might just be stimulating to have a 50-minute chat about where deliberative democracy relates to protest and activism right now. Because we've had a lot of conversations over the last 20 years that have been geared towards showing how deliberative democracy can accommodate protest. And I think that was implicit right from the very start. I think anyone looking at John's work from the 90s or Habermas's work from the 90s would already have known that deliberative democracy had no problem incorporating protest, you know. So I don't think there's anything really further that needs saying about that. We all know by now that deliberative democracy has no problem and should in fact welcome protest for various reasons. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing left to say about the relationship between deliberative democracy and protest, broadly conceived. And a couple of the issues that has been interesting me, one of them's, I suppose, a kind of theoretical conceptual issue about how we theorize or reflect on protest within deliberative democracy. And the other is a sort of more substantive set of issues about how far deliberative Democrats can or should go in accommodating or even just engaging with violent forms of protest. And sort of both of those two themes, what I try to do in the discussion piece is to weave those two together and hopefully raise a couple of points that might be of interest to discuss. The first, the more conceptual, sort of methodological point is really to raise a question about the usefulness of the category of non-deliberative conduct or non-deliberative action. This is something that a lot of pieces written about protest and deliberative democracy will take protest as a kind of example of a non-deliberative action, okay? And this then relates to a more general set of debates among deliberative Democrats, really, about the extent to which deliberative Democrats can incorporate or engage non-deliberative action. And one of the things that I argue in the paper is, again, I don't know whether it's right to sort of present this as an argument. It's more a kind of feeling than anything else. But my feeling is that this category of non-deliberative action might not be terribly useful. And one very simple reason for that is that when you consider the broad range of actions that might fall under the category of non-deliberative action, it's vast. I mean, I think at one point in the paper, I just listed out as many things as I could think of that might plausibly be categorized as non-deliberative action. And I think it was everything except for a very unusually reflective legislative debate or a mini public. You know, I mean, depending on how you define deliberative action, it can incorporate so much. And when a category becomes so broad, one inevitably begins to wonder whether or not it has any real methodological or conceptual purchase. Is it going to really help us to keep talking about non-deliberative action? More specifically in relation to protest, I was struck by how when deliberative Democrats like Arpan Fung, for instance, and others, including myself in some previous publications, when we talk about non-deliberative action in relation to protest, even that tends to obscure lots of important distinctions. For instance, one of the distinctions which is animating a lot of discussion within the political philosophy of protest at the moment is a distinction between civil disobedience and uncivil disobedience. The term uncivil disobedience has become more current as a result of the publication of a number of books and articles across the last 10 years, where theorists have attempted to contrast a kind of traditional conception of civil disobedience with a whole range of other actions that can't be fit within that traditional categorization. Candice Delmas is the author of an excellent book on this particular topic, which kind of like makes the point that a lot of what activists do can't be subsumed within the category of civil disobedience because it's violent, because it's coercive, because it involves covert actions. Even the tone and the tenor of protest can be quite different when it departs from the generic script of civil disobedience. So that's quite a sort of precise, even you might call it technical sense in which, you know, a category like civil disobedience can be shown to contrast with other things. If we continue to categorize both these types of protest as just non-deliberative action, we're missing what's specific and what's different about these particular actions. So in the paper, I talk a little bit about how a couple of the treatments of protest within deliberative democracy, it's fairly clear that they have in mind something that fits quite neatly within the paradigmatic civil disobedience frame. I think Arpan Fung has a really nice discussion of the Harvard campaign Students for a Fairer Wage. And he talks about how they disrupt various activities on campus, that they're trying to push administrators to accept their point of view. And it's true, I'll accept this is non-deliberative behavior. I'm not going to argue that point. But it's also fairly clear that it doesn't particularly challenge deliberative democracy, I think, in any meaningfully or substantive way, because this type of protest typically adheres to a very non-violent tactical repertoire. Typically, it's always carried out with a view to keeping open the possibility of dialogue, even with the people you disagree with. I mean, this is one of the core ideas behind Gandhian nonviolent resistance, which is the ultimate genealogical root of a lot of these tactics. So, of course, this is not deliberative action in the sense that participating in a mini-public is deliberative action. But I think it's not a particularly radical departure, or at the very least, it's a kind of non-deliberative action that one shouldn't be too surprised is easy to fit back in within deliberative democracy once you've uncovered a little bit about the context and about the goals of the protest. On the other hand, there are forms of protest which, on the face of it, are actually a lot harder, I think, to reconcile with deliberative democracy. And one example I consider in the paper a couple of times is anti-fire activism against alt-right protesters. And in fact, I lead off the paper with the case of Richard Spencer being punched in the face by an anti-fire activist. This is, you know, we can argue the ethics of this, the pros and cons of it. But I think one thing you would say about this type of activism is that it's clearly, I think, posing a much deeper challenge, not just to deliberative democracy, but perhaps to any conception of democracy, actually. Again, it's not terribly helpful to use this category of non-deliberative behavior and apply it to actions that are actually so different in terms of their impacts on individuals and also potentially their impact on the broader environment for deliberation. And again, I really want to stress, what's driving this is not an intuition that says that non-violent protest is always right and violent protest is always wrong. I don't think that at all. What's driving this part of the discussion is a sense that we have to very quickly get beyond the stage where we use a category of non-deliberative behavior in an attempt to theorize what's going on here, because that category of non-deliberative behavior, even when applied to protest, is not going to be sufficiently nuanced enough to kind of like enable us to grapple with the specific challenges posed by particular actions. I also, in the context of this bit of the discussion, I think I briefly discussed the already much discussed manifesto put forward by the deliberative systems theorists in the 2012 volume, And there's a 2 or 3 page discussion of protest there. One of the things I note about that is that it's very striking that when you make a systemic test to your criteria of evaluation, in other words, when you try to evaluate an action primarily in terms of how it impacts on sort of systemic functionality or deliberation in a more general sense, it's quite striking because, you know, again, different types of action can have different types of impact on systemic functionality. You know, a very violent, a very coercive action might actually realize some benefits at a systemic level, but still, I suppose, as sort of democratic theorists, as deliberative theorists, we might be a little bit cautious about saying that that's all there is to say, you know. And I think in the context of the systems theorists' discussion of coercion, it's quite helpful. It's a nice little analytic discussion about how sometimes you try to achieve your goals not through trying to persuade people, but through imposing costs on people. This is, you know, a familiar form of cost levying, which has been discussed in multiple places. And the systems theorists talk about how this type of cost levying can be justified in certain environmental contexts, and certain things hold true. But even there, you know, even this analytic category of cost levying, it's actually very broad. You know, a non-violent sit-in can be a form of cost levying. You know, if a load of students at Canberra University occupy the administrator's building, they're imposing a kind of cost on the administrators, right? They're making life difficult for them. They're creating on-the-job trouble. They're just, you know, changing incentive structures confronted by administrators in Canberra. But that's a very different thing to if those students engage in targeted campaigns of harassment and intimidation against particular administrators. Now, that might seem like a sort of far-fetched example, but there are lots of discussions of, for instance, radical forms of animal rights and environmental activism, which make clear that those types of targeted campaigns of harassment and intimidation have been used. And again, I'm not saying this because I want to be moralistic. I mean, perhaps even these actions are justifiable in certain contexts. But they're clearly very different in kind, I think, to the non-violent repertoire that we associate with the civil disobedience tradition, even if they might still have similar systemic consequences for deliberation. So again, I apologize if I've rambled a little bit here. This is all part of my sense that we need to get beyond the category of non-deliberative action as a framework for thinking about protest, because I think that even if you just focus on protest or activism, it incorporates such a broad range of behaviors and actions that we need more nuanced categories. And then moving on to the second part of the paper, I try to focus specifically on violence. I mean, violence, I think, is interesting for a number of reasons. The main reason is that there's a lot of it around. I mean, there is quite a lot of activism and protest that appears to be violent. This is part of the broad wave of activism that has triggered the interest in the category of uncivil disobedience, which I alluded to before. This is really complicated because obviously we know with violence that it's an incredibly loaded term. A lot of people disagree about what is or what is not violence. And a lot of people would disagree about whether, for instance, property destruction should be categorized as violence. I mean, I try to focus on violence in the paper just because I think it's at least a fairly non-controversial example of a form of activism that would be characterized as uncivil. Okay, because civility is also a contested term. Some people disagree about what is or what is not civil, what is or what is not civil or uncivil disobedience. So violence seems to be a pretty good paradigmatic case of uncivil disobedience. It's a form of protest, or activism, which is quite difficult to reconcile, not just with deliberative norms, but with democratic norms. And so I just raise a few questions or points for discussion, which are basically geared towards prodding us as deliberative Democrats to think a little bit more about what we think about violence, about whether or not we can come up with any ways of appraising or evaluating or even just diagnosing, categorizing violent acts, which is distinctive to deliberative democracy, or whether or not we should perhaps just step back at this point and say, well, look, as deliberative Democrats, we're not really going to give you a theory of violent protest, or we're not really going to be in a position to kind of contribute much to those discussions. We're in a position to contribute to discourses surrounding what's good about democracy, or we're in a position to contribute to discourses about how you can improve democracy in certain respects, what kind of institutional innovations that you can make to improve democracy, to make it more thoughtful, reflective, inclusive. Okay, that's our main area of expertise. But we're not really going to give you a theory of when violence is justified. You know, there have to be other theoretical frameworks for that. And my sense is that I would have thought, at least as a deliberative democrat, or someone who identifies more with deliberative democracy than with other paradigms, I suppose I would feel more inclined to say that actually, I think deliberative democracy can and should say a little more about violence. Partly that's just because I think deliberative democracy is a very influential paradigm in democratic thought. And I think there's almost a kind of responsibility, given the status of deliberative democracy in the field, to speak to an issue which is of clear importance and to not step back from it. I would also hope that deliberative democracy does have resources for saying some interesting, distinctive things about violence as a tactic of activism or protest. But to be fair, I don't really do that in the paper. In the paper, what I do instead is to say, here's what some new generation of theorists writing on uncivil disobedience have had to say. And I talk a little bit about, I think it's Abaya Pasternak's excellent recent paper on political rioting. I talk a little bit about Ten Heng Lai's recent paper on political vandalism and other contributions, which I think are of interest because they often try to theorize the use of limited and constrained forms of violence through referring back to their communicative dimensions. And I think that might be something that deliberative democrats would be both interested in and perhaps could also contribute to. So that bit of the paper is very much a way of saying, well, look, there's this literature on uncivil disobedience that might be helpful to us as deliberative democrats in thinking a little bit about how we can theorize violence. But that's not the same thing as me putting forward a view about a deliberative theory of violence. I'm not in a position to do that in that paper, and I don't want to give the impression that I have one. This is very much at the stage of raising points for discussion. So at the end of the paper, I think at the invitation of the reviewers and the editors for the journal, I did try to be a little bit more helpful and programmatic in terms of thinking about where deliberative democracy should go, how can we sort of advance in theorizing or reflecting on violence. And I don't think I say anything particularly novel here. I make the point that there's scope for further investigation, both empirically and normatively. My sense with deliberative democracy is that it's probably more of an empirical framework now than a normative philosophical one. And by that, I mean a lot of the research that seems to be done under the banner of deliberative democracy, and certainly a lot of the papers that are being published, I think are more empirical in focus. I think there's some really interesting stuff on the theory methodological side, but a lot of that, even that, it seems to be geared more towards guiding empirical analysis. So that's just my sense. But obviously, that kind of research could be really useful in terms of thinking about the place of violence or violent activism within deliberative democracy. I guess it should be possible to come up with case studies and to approach something like perhaps the Hong Kong anti-extradition protest movement, perhaps something like Antifa, and try to explore the negative and positive impacts that a violent act or violent campaign has had on a broader systemic deliberative environment. I think that empirical research could be quite interesting, even though I'm slightly reticent at my own ability to carry it out, because I'm much more a normative theorist, but I think there would be scope for some good empirically orientated case studies looking not just at protest and deliberative democracy. Again, I want to be a bit more focused. I want us to focus more on protest that involves violence or acts that involve violence and how that can impact upon broader systemic environments. So a slightly more nuanced approach to looking at case studies. The other point I make in the conclusion is to say that there is still scope, I think, for normative reflection. I do think we need to think a little deeper about the underlying normative values of deliberative democracy and whether and to what extent those normative values or principles would, in a sense, prohibit or prescribe certain forms of action irrespective of their systemic consequences. So this, I should have mentioned this before, that this type of anxiety that's been expressed about deliberative systems theory in particular, I think has been really well articulated by David Owen and Graham Smith in their paper. I mean, that line I gave earlier about certain forms of cost levying having different types of impact, both in their nature and severity, that really coheres with a point that Smith and Owen make about the way in which deliberative systems theorists occasionally seem to have a very consequentialist approach to the evaluation of non-deliberative action. That overlooks what's specifically wrong about the action that's being evaluated. It can often have pretty severe impacts on individuals or groups that remain problematic and perhaps even prohibit the action, irrespective of whether they might have some beneficial impacts on deliberation at a systemic level. I think the issue of violent protest and violent activism obviously poses that question in a very stark sense. And again, at the conclusion, I think I come back to considering Antifa again, because I think they're quite an interesting kind of example to take for reflecting a little bit on the ethics of using violence within activist campaigns and what deliberative Democrats should say about this. I guess the thought would be, look, even if we concede that Antifa activism may have some positive systemic impacts, is that going to be sufficient for us to say that these actions are acceptable or morally appropriate or normatively defensible within a deliberative paradigm? Yeah, okay, so I tell you what I might do, if it's okay with everyone, I might just stop there, because I think I've been speaking for about 20 minutes. I'm conscious that like I said, I haven't really put forward an argument here. That's not the point of the paper. The point really is to raise for discussion a number of issues that are of interest to me, and I'm really interested to see whether other deliberative Democrats are inclined to see them as interesting as well. I mean, do you think the category of non-deliberative behavior is interesting, or is it useful to you in your research? Perhaps I'm being unduly harsh on this idea. More specifically about violence, do you have any intuitions or thoughts about that? I mean, do you think the problem of violence is one that deliberative Democrats should be very aware of? And if so, where are you leaning at the moment in terms of how it can impact on a research agenda, and also the kind of normative issues at stake that I alluded to at the end? So I'll stop talking there, and maybe we can have a discussion for the last half hour or so. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's good. So usual, yeah. Yeah, we can start.